Hello, this is a video on the humanistic approach as part of this approaches module on paper 2. Okay, so we're going to talk about the humanist approach. The humanist approach came about in about the 1960s in America, and it was kind of a reaction against the psychology of Freud and psychodynamics, which they saw as kind of dealing with illness and negativity, and also a reaction against kind of the behaviorist approach to psychology, which they had a few different problems with, and you'll see as we go through how different humanist approach is to the other approaches. Okay, so let's have a little look at some of their key assumptions when they're looking at psychology. So psychology is often a method of trying to find universal laws that apply to large groups of people. So we would know this as kind of the nomothetic approach. Humanistic psychologists completely reject that idea. They like to feel that each individual is very unique, and there's not really it's not really useful to try and generalize within groups of people, just simply because there are too many differences within those groups. I mean, you can imagine it like this. There's a throwaway statement might be men are taller than women. But actually, does that really tell us much about those groups? Because there are certainly very big differences between tall women and short women, and the same with tall men and short men. And there's a big range within each group that you'd call men and women, much more than there is between the average height of a man and the average height of a woman. So doing broad generalizations for humanistic psychologists isn't particularly useful, and that's a big deviation from other psychologists. One of the other key points of difference between humanistic psychology and all other areas of psychology is this concept of free will. So humanistic psychologists are the only ones who are going to go fully down the road of we have the ability completely to choose what we do and in control of our behavior. We do kind of have constraints, of course, like laws and social rules, but ultimately for a humanistic psychologist, we have the complete free will to go against those constraints, whereas other areas of psychology are effectively a method of exploring the ways in which our behavior is determined through various factors. The idea that people should be viewed holistically, again, a big departure really from most other approaches to psychology, where the behavior will try to be reduced to quite a simple aspect, and then that aspect will be used to then explain a wide range of behavior. So for example, a biological psychologist would zoom down maybe onto just the genes, and then use the genetic makeup to then explain a whole range of behaviors from aggression to relationship formation. Humanistic psychologists say no, we can't just look at one aspect of an individual, because we could miss many different aspects for, say, someone's mental health by focusing on too narrow a focus. And again, another area for humanistic psychologists where they're completely away from pretty much all the other approaches is not just ignoring the scientific method, but actually explicitly kind of rejecting the scientific method, being anti-scientific in the way to measure behavior. Humanistic psychologists say, you know what, we can't be objective when we measure humans. We will always be subjective in the way that we carry out our psychology. So there isn't really a way to be scientific about measuring human behavior. So they say, you know what, it just doesn't work when it comes to humans and trying to be too scientific. Now, one of the key psychologists in humanistic psychology is Maslow, and he's come up with a concept called the hierarchy of needs. So the idea is someone becomes the best they can be when they reach a stage called self-actualization. Self-actualization is a bit of a woolly phrase. It's not particularly well operationalized. It's not very easy to measure, but as this is humanistic psychology, they're not too interested in obeying kind of scientific norms about defining their terms. But self-actualization is a concept that you've achieved your full potential. You're the best person you can be kind of creatively and mentally. But to reach this stage, several other needs need to be satisfied first, and we can't move up this pyramid without first settling some of those more basic needs. So you can see at the bottom of this pyramid, our psychological needs would be things like food, warmth, water, just things to physically survive. And then as we go up the pyramid, we would then need to have our safety met. So we have to feel safe and secure where we are. Up again, and we have belongingness and love needs. So feeling that those people around us really care about us, and this could be our partners or friends. One above that could be our esteem, feeling kind of happy about maybe our jobs and our opportunities. And then once we get to that stage, we can then self-actualize. Might be kind of helpful to think about this pyramid in a real life concept or a scenario. And I imagine this particular idea might come up at some point as a applied question. So if you think about this in the context of perhaps say maybe refugees fleeing a war zone, at the beginning of this they might feel very insecure. Their basic physiological needs might not be met. They might have left all their food, their warmth, their water behind with them in their homeland. They're running away, and the first thing is you need to get some food, need somewhere warm to rest, and just need some water. You can imagine if you're in that dire situation, you're not going to be thinking about anything else. Okay, let's say after a short while they manage to reach a refugee camp, and they go, oh, okay, we've got access to some food and water now. What they're going to be worried about is, okay, well, how secure is this refugee camp? Are there guards? Might there be any corruption here? You know, how am I going to be able to survive with my family? So how's the security and safety going to be? So once they've been at the refugee camp for a little while and they feel relatively secure, maybe they've got a small place to settle with some of their belongings. Once they've been there for a little while, they feel safe, they feel secure, they've got some food and drink. They might start exploring the people around them. They might start making friends with those people in neighbouring tents. So they're going to start to build up these belongingness and love needs. You know, they're going to be able to make friends and relationships with those people around them. Perhaps they've been there for a couple of months, and by this stage they're fairly secure that this is a relatively safe place to be. They've certainly got their food and water needs met, and they've made some positive friends around them. At this stage, perhaps they might feel like they want a little bit more out of their time there. Perhaps they would like to go and volunteer or work, perhaps somewhere making bread or making some food somewhere, and then they feel part of the community. They feel like they're giving towards the people they're around, and then, according to Maslow, we would be able to reach self-actualization. So we can see there through a small scenario how people might really prioritize their basic needs before they try to meet their psychological needs, and then ultimately reach their self-fulfillment needs. Okay, so this links into Humanistic's real focus on trying to think about personal development and the building up of kind of creativity and happiness. There's not really a big focus here on problems. There's more focus on the development aspect. Okay, so just re-emphasizing the idea that if your basic needs aren't met, higher needs won't be able to be met. So if you reach self-actualization and then suddenly your basic needs aren't met, you're not able then to be at a stage of self-actualization. Sometimes the term self-actualization is also known as being in a kind of a flow state, and this is quite a common experience for a range of people. There's a good video online about a rock climber who gets to a flow state, religious individuals, and it's kind of a mental state of working incredibly hard and effectively. Okay, we're going to look now at another psychologist, and this is called Rodgers, and he's going to talk about another method of reaching self-actualization, and this is about a concept of free selves that I've thought about. Now, for Rodgers, we have a self concept. So this is how when you self-reflect about who you are, this is kind of who you feel like you are. This is about your self-esteem. If you feel good about yourself, you've got a positive image of yourself, you'll feel quite good about yourself. If you've got low self-esteem, you might have quite a negative image of yourself. Now, this isn't really who you are. This is just your own view of who you are. So this is wrapped up in all the ideas about what a good person is, what it means to be successful in society and all that kind of stuff. So who you think you are is wrapped up in all these big cultural narratives. So that is who you think you are. It's not who you are, but it's who you think you are. There's another self. And this is an ideal self. This is, oh, I wish I was a little bit more. If only I could do. So if those kind of sentences mean that, well, you've got an idea of who you are, but that doesn't match who you really want to be. Maybe you want to be a little bit more hardworking. Maybe you want to be a little bit successful in an area of your life. And you can see there's going to be a gap between the self-concept and your ideal self. And if this gap is quite large, you can imagine this is going to cause some mental problems for the individual. There's also a third self, and this third self is called the real self. Now, the real self is fundamentally unknowable. The real self, the objectively there is a real person, we can never really see. Because whenever we think about ourselves, we always see ourselves in the context of effectively schemas of shortcuts of ways of thinking about our previous experiences through lives. So we can't really see who we are. Other people as well can't see our real self because it's all wrapped in about other experiences they've had with you. So perhaps there is a real self, but ultimately it's unknowable. So what we have to work with is a self-concept, how we generally feel we are, and an ideal self. Okay, so I spoke about a difference between the ideal self and the real and the self-concept, and the bigger the gap being, the more issues there's going to be. Now, congruence is the term talking about how close the self-concept is to the ideal self, and achieving congruence is going to be the goal here. Okay, and if we want to reach that concept called self-actualization, which we talked about briefly with Maslow, we need to be congruent. So, if our ideal self, who we want to be, and the self-concept in some way match, then we can reach congruence. So that's going to happen either by the ideal self reducing to be something more realistic, or self-concept, how we feel ourselves, rising up and building up our self-esteem. This can be helped through something called unconditional positive regard, and you'd hope that you'd have unconditional positive regard from those people around you. What unconditional positive regard is people around you not having any preconditions for just loving and caring about you. They care about you, they see you positively no matter what you do or how you are. So if you've got a family, they're not putting things on you like, oh well, yeah, I'd like you a little bit more if you worked a bit harder. They just, hands up, I like you as you are. So it's much easier to achieve congruence if at some point we're loved for who we are by someone else. So it can be partners, it can be family, or just your friends. They just like you for who you are. They don't kind of put pressure on you to be somebody else. Okay, so these pressures to be someone else, these are called conditions of worth. These ideas is, well, I'd like you a bit more only if, and then X, Y, Z, things that you'd kind of need to achieve. It could be real. They could be real conditions of worth. It could be actually parents saying, well, maybe they don't love you, but they want you to be a little bit more one way or another. Or they can just be in the head of the individual. It could just be a feeling that those around them want them to be a particular way. So we had unconditional positive regard, where people would care for you no matter what you did, or just for who you are. But this idea of there being conditions of worth is going to be wrapped up in the idea of a conditional positive regard. There's positive regard, but it's based on these prior conditions. So it's going to be helpful if we have an example here. Let's say that we've got a child and she feels quite anxious because she's in school and she isn't really getting the grades that they want. But they're going to work really, really hard to try and get the grades, because deep down she kind of feels that her parents only really love her when she gets high grades. Or her parents seem very focused on their children getting really high grades, and it could be just an imagined condition of worth, or perhaps it could be being told directly from her parents that she needs high grades, or maybe she's been in the car while her sister was out of the car, and you could overhear her parents talking about how bad her siblings' poor grades were and how disappointed they were, and she went, oh wow, if they're going to talk about her if she gets bad grades, they must be talking about me in the same way. So these are going to be the conditions of worth, which is going to make it very difficult for someone to achieve congruence. Okay, so if a child or anybody feels these conditions of worth, they don't feel unconditional positive regard. What I'd like you to do as an additional question in your notes is I'd like you to give me another example, similar to the one I've given you just above, but I want you to talk about somebody in a romantic relationship. What examples of conditions of worth might someone have if they're in a romantic relationship? Okay, so someone's in this situation and they're unable to achieve congruence. They're unable for that reason to achieve self-actualization. Well, humanist psychologists have come up with a treatment. They've come up with a counseling program. And this is called client-centered therapy. And it's a little bit different from some of the other therapy programs, as we'll see. So this is made by Rodgers, so it's based on his principles of congruence. The therapist's role in this situation is to give the client unconditional positive regard. Give them the unconditional positive regard they're missing from their parents or friends and family. So the whole process that they'll go through is trying to reduce this difference between the ideal self and the self-concept, bringing them closer together, and then by either rising the ideal self up, lowering the ideal self down to something more realistic, or rising the self-concept up by increasing self-esteem, we're going to improve the level of congruence, or possibly doing both to try and get to congruence. Now, in this therapeutic situation, the client is the center. It's called client-centered therapy. It's not about the therapist giving all the solutions. It's about supporting the client in exploring their own issues and coming up with their own solutions to their problems. Whereas a CBT therapist might give homework and be quite explicit about identifying problem thoughts. In client-centered therapy, the work is very much down on the individual. Okay, let's have a little look at some of the evaluations for humanistic psychology. So there is a pretty fundamental argument for humanistic psychologists that actually most of psychology has it wrong. Most of psychology will try and break down groups of people and then try and explain the behaviors of groups of people. So perhaps women are like this, men are like this. Young people, old people, different ethnicities, different cultural groups, and then try and present these groups as one whole. So you might go, Americans do X, Germans do Y, when actually the differences within these groups of people are huge. So we could say that perhaps humanists do have a point about the range and differences between individual groups. And I've got pictures there of a very tall guy and a very small guy, a very tall lady and a very short lady. And you can definitely say, well, does it really make sense to say that men are taller than women when we have such big differences between each group? Okay. a criticism of humanistic psychology. They might not take it as a criticism themselves because they reject the scientific approach, but we could definitely criticize them for the fact that terms such as self-actualization and congruence, they're not fully operationalized. They're not explained how we would ever measure self-actualization or ever really measure congruence. So because we're not able to measure it and we can't say they're clearly defined, we might again criticize them for being kind of unscientific. Now, I said at the beginning that humanistic psychology was a reaction in America against some of the previous psychological movements such as behaviorism and psychodynamic. But humanistic psychology is a construct of its own time and place. So it was 1960s America. So there was a whole peace and love kind of movement. And humanistic psychology could be seen as quite an American way of seeing psychology. It is all about the individual. It is all about personal success and making yourself as good as you possibly can be. When actually, most people don't live like that. Americans might see individualism as kind of the gold standard of how to live. But other cultures, like Indian cultures, Chinese cultures, African cultures, quite often are collectivist in nature. So they see success and achievement not as a result of the individual, but actually as a group effort. So a humanist psychologist might come into an Indian family and criticize one of the people in the Indian families about maybe not having some of their needs met and not reaching self-actualization, when actually for them they gain their sense of worth as fulfilling a function within their family. And it may be a little bit culturally biased for humanist psychologists to come in and kind of make value judgments about people's ability to self-actualize, because it's kind of inferring that they're in some way inferior. Okay, one kind of nice thing about the humanistic psychology is it is quite positive. It is focusing on personal change really at any stage of life. I mean, quite often psychologists would say, well, your behavior is pretty much locked down either from biological methods or reasons or from your experience from early childhood, when actually it's quite a nice thing to think that actually at any stage in life we can develop and become a better person. So a nice distinction from a deterministic point of view. Might not be true, but it's kind of nice to think about. Okay. What I'm going to do now is going to look at some comparisons with some of the other approaches. So humanistic psychology is probably one of the easiest areas of psychology to compare against the other four approaches because it is so different from some of these other approaches. Okay, so first of all, we'll look at behaviorism, our learning theories. So humanistic psychology is going to focus on free will, and we'll notice this is going to be mentioned for each of these approaches because humanistic psychology is the only approach that's going to focus on free will. Whereas behaviorists will look at environmental determinism, so they'll look at experiencing leading to particular behaviors. Whereas humanistic psychologists would say, ultimately, we have the decision making. Humanistic psychology is also anti-scientific, and they'll also be more holistic in their approach to understanding behavior, taking in multiple aspects. The behaviorist approach, though, is using experimentation, it is scientific, and it is trying to reduce complex behavior to simple, perhaps reward mechanisms. Humanistic psychology focuses on the kind of idiographic approach, so looking at case studies, taking each individual as unique, whereas behavioral is going to take a nomothetic approach, saying that, well, the best way to do this is to do large studies and then applying those findings to a wider population. Okay, again, in cognitive, humanistic psychologists on the side of free will, the idea we're in control of our own actions, whereas a cognitive psychologist would say, well, actually our actions are determined by whatever schema we've developed during our life. Again, humanistic psychology is case studies, and cognitive would be a nomophatic approach. Biological approach, again, humanistic psychology on the side of free will, whereas biological would be biological determinism, so stuff like aggression is going to be based on your genes. Again, humanistic psychologist being anti-scientific, taking a holistic approach, and biological certainly being probably the most scientific method and certainly the most reductionist method as well. Again, the reflection between humanistic psychology being ideographic and biological being nomophatic, so the same argument as the others. With psychodynamic, there are actually some common ground between psychodynamic and humanistic psychologists, especially their use of the case study as part of their methodology, and maybe a less scientific approach to psychology. But there are certainly some points of difference. The psychodynamic perspective is based on the idea that we are determined by our internal mental processes that we don't have access to, such as the unconscious, leading to the idea of psychic determinism. And again, humanistic psychology would say no, we ultimately have the ability to make our own decisions based on free will. One point of difference, which is different from the other approaches, is humanism is a very positive approach to psychology. They don't focus on the negativity, the disorders. They focus on actually just improving everybody's situation. Whereas the psychodynamic approach will focus much more perhaps on the negative aspects of human behavior. So, what happens when psychostages of development goes wrong, etc. And defense mechanisms. Another point of difference between psychodynamic and humanistic is humanistic psychologists see you can develop at any stage in life, whereas from what we know about psychodynamics, our problems are kind of fixed in place from our very first few years of mental development through the psychosexual stages. So for psychodynamics, once you've gone through childhood, you're kind of stuck there without a considerable amount of work. Okay, so that is the humanistic approach. Any comments, leave them below, and I'll try and answer them. If you can remember to do the question I asked you to do for the class, that would be great. Thank you.